see. Abriu para você, Mari?
Let me refresh it again. Not yet.
Not yet, but here. Still, but here it shows, right? Oh, we're live.
Yeah.
We're
live? Okay.
We're live.
So, boa tarde a todas as pessoas que nos assistem. É com um enorme prazer que nós damos início à segunda mesa do dia de hoje, do nosso evento, em homenagem a Toni Morrison. E antes que nós possamos começar de fato as apresentações, eu gostaria de dar um aviso, um recado, na verdade, referente aos certificados. Nós, da organização, vamos enviar um formulário a todos aqueles que desejam obter o certificado, mas para isso é necessário comparecer no mínimo 75% do nosso evento. Tudo bem? Dito isso, dado esse recado, eu passo a palavra para a professora Maria Elisa Cervasco, que vai introduzir as nossas palestrantes. Um bom evento a todos.
I think I should do that in English, right? So good afternoon, everybody. Good something to Christa and Aine. I don't know what part of the day you're in, but anyway. Hello. It's a pleasure to be here introducing my learned colleagues, Christa and Albrecht-Crane and Aine Adams, who are going to discuss one of my favorite American authors, Toni Morrison. So what I'll do here, I will introduce Christa and Aine. We have already decided that we are going to be on first name basis. And then each one will speak for 40 minutes. And after that, we'll have time for questions. So Christa Albrecht-Crane is an associate professor and assistant chair in the Department of English and Literature at Utah Valley University. Some of her publications include Becoming Minoritarian, Post-Identity in Toni Morrison's Jazz, which came out in 2003, and co-edited an essay collection entitled Adaptation Studies, New Approaches, that was 2010. Her research interests include cultural studies and the intersection of British cultural studies and French post-structuralism. Christa asks me to tell you that she lived in Romania for a long part of her life. Then she moved to Germany, where I suspect she got the Albrecht part of her name. And then she moved to the United States, where she did her PhD at the University of Michigan, and she has been teaching in Utah for the last 30 years. Right, now Aine Adams is Professor Emerita upon retiring from the African Studies and Research Center at Cornell University. She served as the director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Memorial Center for Pan-African Culture in Accra, Ghana, from 2005 to 2010, while also teaching as visiting professor at the University of Ghana, Boyce Davis. In 1986, some of her publications include, I apologize in advance if I make mistakes with the names, the Gambika Studies of Women in African Literature with Carol Boyce Davis, 1986, and essays in honor of the Ama Ata Aidu, a reader in African Cultural Studies, in 2012. Her areas of academic specialization include continental African women's writing and Afro-German cultural studies. That's interesting. Thank you very much. So without much ado, I pass the word to Christa, and who will talk for, as I said, for about 40 minutes. So go ahead, Christa.
Thank you very much. I'm extremely honored to be here today, and I want to thank everybody for organizing this wonderful conference, and especially for inviting me to speak. I was delighted to get the invitation. And I've been communicating intensely with Mariana the last few weeks and days, and I want to thank her especially warmly because I had a lot of questions and she was always forthcoming and incredibly nice and friendly. So thank you for that tremendously. And I also feel honored to be on this panel with Anne, and I'm looking forward to your presentation very much, Anne. So then I will get started and I will ask for the opening slide. So my presentation, I hope I'm going to handle this okay, because I have quite a lot of slides and a bunch of text to tell you or read out loud. So hopefully my presentation will be smooth and will make sense to you all who are listening. And so let's get started. I decided to just present again on the article I published in 2003, but I did update especially my conclusions a little bit, and had tremendous fun actually putting together this presentation because without a doubt, Toni Morrison is one of my favorite writers, and it's been wonderful to revisit my old article, and especially the ideas, my argument that still makes good sense to me, I think, today even. So my talk is titled Becoming Minoritarian, Post-Identity in Toni Morrison's Jazz. Next. And my presentation overall addresses one of the most urgent political and cultural questions in the contemporary theoretical landscape: how to account for the production of identities and their material, everyday realities for social subjects, and how to work towards transforming such identity effects. Next, please. And my theoretical apparatus comes from two French post-structuralist thinkers, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, and especially I'll be concentrating today on their concept, becoming minoritarian. And my thesis specifically is that Toni Morrison's linguistic experimentation, particularly the narrator, in her 1992 novel Jazz, contributes to the urgent work of anti-racist and anti-sexist politics. By focusing on purging language of its racist constructs, Morrison works to imagine and articulate the sort of transformation or possibility that acknowledges the reality of race and disarms it. The majority of the narrative in this historical novel takes place in Harlem. Not quite yet. Previous slide. Yeah, thank you. So the majority of the narrative in this novel takes place in Harlem during the 1920s. However, as the pasts of the various characters are explored, the narrative extends back to the mid-19th century American South. The plot: 52-year-old Joe Trace shoots his 18-year-old girlfriend dead, and Joe's wife, Violet, forces her way to Dorcas's corpse at the funeral and tries to cut her face. Mayhem ensues. The narrative itself carries much of the novel's acuity. Jazz is structured, much like jazz music itself, as an ensemble of improvisational riffs voiced by several speakers that are sometimes unmistakably distinct from each other, and at other times are not so easily distinguished. The novel opens with a distinctive, self-reflexive, unnamed insider narrative voice that persists throughout the 10 untitled chapters in the novel. As Henry Louis Gates notes in his review of Jazz, quote, "A disembodied narrator slips easily and guilelessly from third-person all-knowingness to first-person lyricism without ever relaxing its grip upon our imagination," end quote. This inside narrator tells the story of Violet, Joe, and Dorcas in Harlem, following a stream of associations and non-linear digressive details to create a complex web of people, places, and stories, engaging issues of violence, innocence, motherhood, race, jazz music, women and femininity, memory and the past, and versions of reality. Next, please. So to introduce Deleuze and Guattari's concepts in brief here, they offer many provocative theoretical concepts, and they analyze any given society as a process of two tendencies that you see here on the slide. The first tendency they identify as a binary stratification or territorialization, that's their term, of social space that produces identity and subject positions. The second tendency in any society is a deterritorialization, an excess, a remainder, an escape of such stratification that evades the logic of identity. In other words, the first mode of agency is the material for building artificial territorialities, and the architectural design to which it corresponds is what Deleuze and Guattari call the arborescent or the majoritarian schema of identity, a punctual system comprising a variety of points: man, male, adult versus female, woman, and child. From the point of view of this arborescent or majoritarian schema of identity, anti-racist work is identity-driven, a form of self-expression and a critique of domination that engages those social identities. Now, in contrast to this first tendency, the desire of thinking and becoming other builds lines of flight, also a Deleuze and Guattarian term, or lines of escape between points. It makes a rhizomatic, they call it, so they juxtapose the arborescent model to the rhizomatic model. So a rhizomatic and minoritarian mobile system grafted onto the monumental punctual system, turning it away from itself. In fact, Deleuze and Guattari's theory is affirmative. What matters is what sweeps through the artificial territorialities and their process of segregation. So their emphasis lies on strategies and modes that engage lines of flight away from the tendency of territorialization. Next, please. And I have a quote here from Pelagia Gulimari, who works with Deleuze and Guattari and feminism, and she helps us out with this concept, noting that she says, this is then the ethics of inclusion that underlies the concept of becoming minoritarian, to invent within a particular territoriality the practical procedure that will enhance or accelerate the second tendency. Next slide, please. So I see basically my argument revolves around my sort of the resonances that I see between Deleuze and Guattari's concept of lines of flight and Morrison's work. And in fact, Morrison herself said in her essay Home, she said that she's interested to eliminate the potency of racist constructs in language. Furthermore, she also notes this statement right here. She says, these questions, which have engaged so many, have troubled all my work. How to be both free and situated, how to convert a racist house into a race-specific yet non-racist home, how to enunciate race while depriving it of its lethal cling. They are the questions of concept, language, of trajectory, of habitation, of occupation, and although my engagement with them has been fierce, fitful, and constantly, I think, evolving, they remain in my thoughts as aesthetically and politically unresolved. All right, next slide, please. So let's discuss, I'm going now to discuss the first tendency, that identity line, right, the arborescent model. So for the first tendency, Deleuze tells us the following. He says there's no subject but a product of subjectivity, so the product of a process, right, that forms subjects. And he also explains that the first kind of line which forms us is segmentary, of rigid segmentarity, deploying binary machines of social classes, of sexes, men, women, of ages, child, adult, of races, black and white, of sectors, public and private, of subjectivations, ours, not ours. Thus, what we see here is that Deleuze suggests that subjects are constituted by different social formations. More specifically, we are positioned to take up points or places in terms of who we are, in terms of social identities. And we are seen as possessing varying degrees of agency as an attribute of who we are. This formulation of subjectivity is never final. It is continually made and remade. The process of subject formation goes on incessantly and remains in a more or less precarious relation of composition and decomposition with the society by which it is produced. Now, in specific social contexts, this production of subjectivity has historical and ideological power to create dominant codes which organize life. In Morrison's cultural context, and ours in general, like in Western countries in this historical position that we find ourselves in, we can observe certain dominant codes, these arborescent lines of organization that in our society give rise to your average adult white male heterosexual European speaking a standard language, right? So these subject categories are the kind of the dominant ones. Now, specifically, what I would like to do next is to examine a little bit what are the social and cultural effects of this domination on Black characters in Morrison's novel. And I'm going to argue that not only does race inform the social landscape as a political force in jazz, but it enters into the characters' most intimate and personal experiences of themselves in the world. The novel explores this dimension with great care and detail. As readers learn, the character Violet grows up in Virginia with a mother who, in the face of horrendous Jim Crow laws and lynchings, and abandoned for the most part by a husband who is driven away by poverty, goes insane and commits suicide, leaving the 12-year-old Violet traumatized. Violet is then raised for 11 years by her grandmother, True Bell, a woman who 18 years earlier had to leave her husband and 2 children in Virginia to accompany and serve a white mistress who in turn had been shunned by her father because she had conceived a baby with a slave. Joe, who marries Violet, says in the novel that white people, quote, had to pity a thing before they could like it, end quote, gives himself a last name, Trace, since his parents left without a trace. He grows up an orphan in a foster family searching for his mother, who becomes a mythical figure of madness, danger, and escape in the Black community's imagination. Canadian scholar Avad Ibrahim, who uses Deleuze and Guattari's concepts to theorize an anti-racist educational intervention, clarifies that, quote, it is these stories that will further our understanding of everyday racism, human degradation, and general annihilation of minoritarian bodies. Next, please. So, in other words, what I'm saying here is that race continues to be a powerful social construct and signifier. Actually, let's go back. Next slide, please, forward. Yeah, there it is, yes. So race continues to be a powerful social construct and signifier around which subjectivity is constructed. Morrison describes the racist house and enunciates race as a constitutive element for Black individuals whose sense of self and community develops in this binary social system and demands their continued performance of race. Another fascinating character whom Morrison invents in the novel is Golden Gray, who is made to pass as white by his white mother, Vera Louise, who conceived the boy with a former Black slave in the 1870s. They live with her Black maid, True Bell, Violet's grandmother. I will refer to Golden Gray again in a minute. Thus we see here, next slide, please. Thus, we see here that Black characters participate in a hierarchical and oppressive social system by compromising self-worth and poise. And these effects, Morrison insists in the novel, are palpable and potent consequences of a racialized and racist identity production. Race is exposed as a form of masquerade, as readers can see in the highly racially charged passage, for example, of Violet and Joe's train journey north from Virginia to New York. As the Black conductor walks from the white part of the train into the segregated colored section, the narrator comments that the Black occupants, quote, were presided over and waited upon by a Black man who did not have to lace his dignity with a smile, end quote. In the cars containing white passengers, the porter performs the stereotypical role demanded of the Black subject as a jovial entertainer. I want to now shift to analyzing the second tendency in any territoriality as Deleuze and Guattari see it. That is to say, Morrison cunningly undermines social identity in her novel. I will argue here that she completes this subversion in 2 ways. First, thematically by presenting laughter as an eruptive force, and secondly, by undermining the role of the novel's narrative. Just 1 second here. Yeah. First, let's examine how Morrison suggests thematically in the novel that laughter can be both healing and transformative when it emerges from within the Black community and not as a normative, humiliating demand from the outside. Next slide. So then now we're looking at Deleuze and Guattari's concept of lines of flight and becoming minoritarian. One more, please. Yeah. Lines of flight, specifically about lines of flight of humor, Deleuze has the following to say. He says, what a strange broken line. Humor is treacherous. It is treason. Humor is atonal, absolutely imperceptible. It makes something shoot off. Next, please. Okay, so first Deleuze and Guattari in the first quote I just read explain that humor imposes kind of on a dominant code of language, imposes a minoritarian use, right? It attacks a binary system by allowing this other force, this line of flight, to enter the field. So in other words, both thematically, but also at the level of language usage, humor and laughter break into and break up by way of using what Deleuze and Guattari term lines of flight, a rigid arborescent structure in which conceptually a social space is suffused with binary pairs, negative dialectics, and the logic of identity. And in fact, on this point right here, D. Diane Davis helps us by noting, quote, laughter that shatters is an affirmative laughter arising from the overflow, the excess, and capable of momentarily and instantaneously catapulting us out of negative dialectics by negating negation itself. And in fact, this is here's actually the voice of the narrator from Jazz. And at one point, the narrator says this: that kind of fascination, permanent and out of control, seizes children, young girls, men of every description, mothers, brides, and barfly women. And if they have their way and get to the city, they feel more like themselves, more like the people they always believed they were. Nothing can pry them away from that. The city is what they want it to be: thriftless, warm, scary, and full of amiable strangers. So I think here we can hear, right, already this other dimension that has nothing to do with, with race or with identity, with subjectivity. So we have language here from the narrator that tries to break through that sort of that racist coding that language has in our society. Next slide, please. So what I'm arguing here is that Morrison's characters do not negate the effects of race, but rather they see through them by revealing their potent and at the same time absurdly contingent significance, exposing lines of flight among moments of belonging that are not reducible to identity any longer. One more slide, please. One slide forward. Yes. So these are lines of flight, among them moments of becoming that are not reducible to identity any longer. In fact, to underscore the pernicious illogicality and irony of how race is made to function and to define people, after the birth of Golden Gray, the light-skinned mixed-race son of a white woman and her black lover, quote, True Belle laughed out loud the minute she laid eyes on him, and thereafter every day for 18 years, end quote. Next slide, please. So specifically in Jazz then, hang on a second now, Yes, so what we're talking about here, and this is a wonderful point from the cultural theorist Stuart Hall, who said this. He said, one suddenly understands that one is always inside a system of languages that partly speak us, which we are always positioned within and against. So what I'm trying to work out here now is that element of our participation in culture and the languages that speak through us, right, in which we work against the positioning that language demands of its subjects at any point. Next quote, please. Or next slide, yes. So what I'm arguing is that Morrison disarms racial stratification at the level of language itself, most evidently by the cunning construction of the narrative voice in the novel. Okay. Hang on a second. I think I'm so sorry, everybody, but I'm not seeing my slides here about that I have about laughter. I think I might have made a mistake with my reading. So sorry that I'm interrupting this now. Let me see. Shoot. Yeah, we'll just go forward. We'll just go forward here. Okay, so next slide, please. The narrator, yes. So let me discuss specifically the role of the narrator in jazz, because I think those of you who've read the novel, I'm sure you agree with me that we have an incredibly creative, but also kind of confusing narrator at times, because what happens is that the narrator becomes really self-reflexive of its own role it plays in creating this narrative, this novel, this particular set of events, and this particular set of characters. Okay. So what I'm saying is that, as the slide notes here, the narrator is the narrative, the book itself, and the language that makes this story indeed any story possible. The focus on language as such lends the novel a degree of self-reflexivity that illuminates the extent to which language drives social production, territorialization, and is also one of the sites of its momentary deterritorialization. So in other words, in jazz, Morrison plays with a convention of the omniscient speaker, right? The convention in the novel, in writing novels, that has to do with the omniscient speaker. In most literature, the omniscient narrator is a naturalized convention. But in jazz, the omniscient narrator's knowledge and power are undermined by the narrator's own knowledge of what it cannot know. As I noted at the beginning, the multiple and self-contradictory omniscient narrative voice is indeterminate. It is neither male nor female, neither young or old, neither rich or poor. This indeterminacy about the form of the narrative voice extends into the narrator's own sense of unreliable and contingent knowledge about the characters. The difficulty of understanding people's motivations and struggles becomes clear as the narrator tries to make sense of Golden Gray, the person who is, or the character who is arguably the most torn subject in the novel, not quite white, not quite black, and thus occupying a contradictory identity position. For example, the narrator seems disgusted with its initial depiction of Golden Gray. As he travels to find his father, his black father, he is first characterized as an arrogant, vain man who could care less about the black pregnant woman he encounters, the woman called Wild, who is actually Joe's mother. Attempting to ease the impression of Golden Gray as racist and heartless, the narrator revises its story, telling of the encounter between Golden and Wild a second time, and describing him in more sympathetic terms the second time around. In the second version, the narrator admits, quote, "I like to think of him that way," end quote. The narrator shapes the two versions of Golden Gray to accommodate the complicated race discourse at work, only to discover in the end that seeing him through an identity lens alone does not encompass Golden well at all. In fact, here's what the narrator says, for example. He says, it is risky, I'd say, trying to figure out anybody's state of mind, right? Next quote, please. And look at what the narrator says to the readers. He notes this: "What was I thinking of? How could I have imagined him so poorly? Not notice the hurt that was not linked to the color of his skin or the blood that beat beneath it, but to some other thing that longed for authenticity, for a right to be in this place effortlessly without needing to acquire a false face, a laughless grin, a talking posture." And I think right here, this reminds us of the other passage in the novel about the train conductor, very directly. "I have been careless and stupid, and it infuriates me to discover again how unreliable I am." So here the narrator undercuts the demands of an identity discourse it has so far employed in trying to understand Golden Gray. "How could I have imagined him so poorly?" the narrator just said, realizing that it had characterized Golden Gray in terms of identity, a false face, a laughless grin. All these identity markers are not sufficient, the narrator recognizes here, to make sense of something in gray that runs beneath all these forces. A hurt that was not linked to the color of his skin, something that longed for authenticity, without needing to acquire identity commitments. In its struggle to articulate its own mistaken but unavoidable reliance on identity, then, the narrative voice finally imagines Golden Gray's racially traumatized self seeking to transcend race as he confronts his Black father. In short, the narrator invokes Golden Gray in a non-identitarian way of becoming, rather than a being captured only by identity. In another passage, the narrator declares, "Now I have to think this through carefully, even though I may be doomed to another misunderstanding. I have to do it and not break down. Not hating him is not enough. Liking, loving him is not useful. I have to alter things. I have to be a shadow who wishes him well, like the smiles of the dead left over from their lives. I want to dream a nice dream for him and another of him. Lie down next to him, a wrinkle in the sheet, and contemplate his pain, and by doing so, ease it, diminish it. I want to be the language that wishes him well, speaks his name, wakes him when his eyes need to be open." This is a wonderful passage. And I see in it that the narrator expresses a wish to change the manner of trying to enable Golden Gray, to patiently and momentarily dismantle the normative language of race and racism, and find potential movements of deterritorialization of becoming minoritarian. Next slide. Let's go to the next slide. Yes. In an interview, Morrison actually explains that, quote, "In jazz, the dynamite fuse to be lit was under the narrative voice, the voice that could begin with claims of knowledge, inside knowledge, and indisputable authority. I know that woman." This is the very beginning of the novel, and we'll look at it in more detail in just a minute. And end with a blissful epiphany of its vulnerable humanity and its own needs, a place where race both matters and is rendered impotent. Thus, Morrison is interested in how claims of knowledge and authority in language remain insufficient in seeing the whole picture. Indeed, she seems to suggest that language can never know and understand it all, as when the narrator doubts being able to tell the story and to know. For instance, the narrator writes, "I doubt that anymore. Something is missing there, something rogue, something else you have to figure in before you can figure it out," end quote. This something else I see as lines of flight, as an excess, an overflow of intensity not containable by identity production. Such excess evades the deliberateness and normative habits of the narrative voice, because the narrator has been too much focused on making sense of the events through the lens of race identity. The narrator intones, quote, "They reach grown people for something beyond, way beyond, and way, way down underneath tissue." Further questioning its ability to know, the narrator tells us, next quote, or next slide, I'm sorry. "It was loving the city that distracted me and gave me ideas, made me think I could speak its loud voice and make that sound human. I missed the people altogether." Right? So here the narrator again juxtaposes becoming human with the predictability of a narrative voice that cannot contain that humanity or know it. In that sense, the narrator in jazz carries out a totalizing performance, a majoritarian tendency, before recognizing that something escapes that it cannot enclose and control, the intensity and irreducibility of the lives it attempts to render. The narrator reaches an impasse that we must understand as racially motivated. In this moment of tension, the narrator must confront the extent to which its authorial power is rooted in racialized discourse. Next, please. So the narrator tells us, quote, busy they were, busy being original, complicated, changeable, human, I guess you'd say, while I was the predictable one, confused in my solitude into arrogance, thinking my space, my view was the only one that was or that mattered. I got so aroused while meddling, while finger shaping, I overreached and missed the obvious. So, in other words, Morrison enables here, I think, an internally discentered anti-racist work. The narrative is undoubtedly African-American, but it also interbreeds with other minoritarian movements, including, and this is my final point, the reader's non-subjectivity. So what I'm going to argue now, finally, my last point is going to be that the narrative voice indeed performs a minoritarian disequilibrium that engages the reader at a non-subjectified level as well, to which I now turn. Next slide, please. And so to explore this point about the reader's direct involvement in the novel, let's look at the very beginning of Jazz. It opens like this. I know that woman. She used to live with a flock of birds on Lenox Avenue. Know that husband too. He fell for an 18-year-old girl with one of those deep down spooky loves that made him so sad and happy he shot her just to keep the feeling going. So you see that first word requires readers' immediate active participation. It is a direct address, the book speaking to the reader. Is the sound of sucking air through one's teeth, right? Or, as I've seen suggested, it could also be the scratching hiss of a record needle making contact with the surface of a record, right? Could be that. But in any case, it suggests an orality that is characteristic of storytelling, as well as a familiarity with the reader that engages immediately at an affective, desubjectified level. The opening is suggestive of one person gossiping to another, thus seducing readers and drawing them into the story at a provocatively intimate level. Morrison has repeatedly experimented with this characteristic of engaging the reader through oral devices, among which the sound or word plays a central role. In Jazz, for example, one of Violet's interlocutors, quote, sucked her teeth at the shaded windows, end quote. And later we read, quote, Alice sucked her teeth, end quote. Morrison also uses this sound in Beloved. In her essay, Unspeakable Things Unspoken, Morrison explains that the opening of her novel, The Bluest Eye, quote, provides the stroke that announces something more than a secret shared, but a silence broken, a void filled, and unspeakable things spoken at last, end quote. The same thing can be said about the opening of Jazz. Serves as both an invitation and a challenge to the reader to engage with the text in an intimate encounter that will ask us to recognize the potency of race constructions, and also to link with the text simultaneously to attempt to disarm that identity discourse. And I see here a very, very strong echo to Deleuze, who says that becoming minor in language is enacted by the tension in language and the limit in language. And moreover, this kind of writing Deleuze characterizes as, quote, digging under the stories, cracking open the opinions and reaching regions without memories when the self must be destroyed. I think this is at work in Jazz. I think the narrative voice transforms its composition of order and structure into a line of flight that connects directly with the reader at a non-personal, non-identitarian level. When the narrator speaks directly to the reader at the very end of the novel specifically, Morrison lets language loose, to explore its limits, to stretch it beyond its constraints as words on a page, to experiment with making language transparent and show its performative, unstable condition. Let's hear the narrator in the last few pages of the novel. The narrator writes, I envy Joe and Violet's public love. I myself have only known it in secret, shared it in secret, and longed to show it. To be able to say out loud what they have no need to say at all. That I have loved only you, surrendered my whole reckless self to you and nobody else. You, the reader, right? That I want you to love me back and show it to me. That I love the way you hold me. How close you let me be to you. I like your fingers on and on, lifting, turning. I watched your face for a long time now and missed your eyes when you went away from me, talking to you and hearing you answer. That's the kick. In other words, the book speaks directly to me, right? It is as if the narrative voice comes to life and is able to resonate with me at an affective, certainly erotic level with every reader. It speaks without speaking. It shatters the binary pairing of speech against writing and thus upends language's totalizing tendencies. The narrator, the book, language here produce a sense of strength in its minoritarian movement of undercutting an illusion of a master narrative. The narrative voice fights against language. It betrays a sense of closure, of order, of structured control, as it ends the narrative with disorder, ambiguity, and an openness that draws the reader into its realm. In effect, this narrative voice gets at so much more than being in terms of identity categories. It conjures a becoming as it transforms the discourse of identity that surrounds it. In that regard, Morrison's experimentation with language offers a sense of revolutionary, I think, post-identity agency. Next quote. In her Nobel Prize lecture, Morrison admonishes, make up a story. Narrative is radical, creating us at every moment it is being created. If her novel thus achieves one task, it is to illustrate how reality happens. In between the words uttered, written by the narrative voice, in its inability to read the characters in terms of identity alone, and in its final surrender to language's indeterminacy. As the narrator puts it, its narrative is about people who, when they speak, regardless of the accent, treated language as the same intricate, malleable toy designed for their play. So I argue then that the power of this novel lies in its remarkable capacity to facilitate linguistic play and to engage in a communal experience with the reader that defies a dominant discourse of identity. In this sense, Morrison could be said to use a very specific anti-racist strategy, to use the form of the novel and a particular mode of storytelling rooted in the African American tradition to upend and disarm racism in its various forms, shapes, and permutations. So now let's read and listen to and feel the lines of flight of the narrative voice at the very end of Jazz. This is how the novel ends. I can't tell anyone that I've been waiting for this all my life, and being chosen to wait is the reason I can. If I were able, I'd say it. Say, make me, remake me. You are free to do it, and I am free to let you, because look where your hands are now. And thus the novel ends. Morrison indeed enacts here, through her innovative narration in Jazz, the trope of the talking book in African American culture, while simultaneously problematizing the notion that a book or language is an infallible means from which to gain knowledge. In his astute reading of Jazz, the scholar Michael Nolan identifies in the novel, quote, a semantic crisis necessarily posed by the racial divide, end quote. Nolan further explains that, quote, the blackness Morrison would recover for her own fiction should be located within the ambiguous invitation that Jazz extends to white listeners to participate in something at once familiar and alien, and to transcend race through the encounter with a racially marked text, end quote. Toni Morrison's narrative experimentation in Jazz indeed presents us, that is me, a white reader, with a semantic form that resists simple territorialization of race. In addition to a rejection of representation, the narrative suggests a creative exercise in desubjectification. As it asks its readers to engage with it at a non-subjective level, the novel itself exists as language, not as a possession of Toni Morrison, the author. The novel becomes a real being, its own writing and reading process, troubling the barriers between reader and writer, self and other, man and woman, black and white. The narrator is the voice that wants to be the city, the voice that wants to give golden gray life, In this way, the novel can be said to be freed from the grid of social codes that usually govern its role. The novel, in the sense of novelty, right? Something novel is presented, emerges. I think jazz perfectly argues and enacts this role. And finally, I'll finish with what actually, with this four-line poem right here that actually Morrison decided to set as the epigraph for her novel Jazz. And it's an excerpt from a larger poem called Thunder Perfect Mind from the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt, which is an early Christian Gnostic manuscript that was found in I think in the 1940s. And we see here, Morrison selected these four lines, and I'm going to read them. They are, I am the name of the sound and the sound of a name. I am the sign of the letter and the designation of the division. So here the poem identifies language as the signifier, and it's signified in a tradition of designating division. And yet the novel itself, while it continually uses the same language of divisions along categories of race, gender, age, class, and so on, it is also the very site of a rupture. This language here in the novel also admits that its own knowledge claims are constantly undone by the potential for novelty also contained in language. This is a practical and concrete political resistance that is happening around us at every moment in which language is at play. As Morrison reminds us, this resistance proceeds by experimentation and remains tentative, unfinished, unknown. And I want to end my presentation with this very helpful point made by Michael Nolan, who wrote a wonderful essay on jazz himself. And he notes that Morrison insists we must remember that everything of value she writes is about not just the community or the village, but you, the isolated reader who may be Black, white, female, gay, straight, old, or young, the isolated reader in search of some connection to some other self through the printed word. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christa, for your enlightening talk. And now I pass the word to Aine.
Also for inviting me. And I certainly enjoyed Christa's talk, and she's enabled me to think about jazz in some ways that I hadn't before. Could I have the first slide, please?
Yeah, just a second.
Okay.
I'm sharing the screen.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. I have been doing some research for the last year or so on the reception of Toni Morrison in Europe, but specifically French and German-speaking Europe. So I'm working with media reception, both print and electronic, newspapers, magazines, websites, and so forth, in the 5 countries of Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, and France. And so so my presentation today is based largely on obituaries written in August of 2019, when Toni Morrison died on August 5th in that year. These obituaries enable me to get a kind of comprehensive view of what the journalists and other writers had of Toni Morrison. There were many articles and reviews of books and interviews and so forth, but the obituaries are very comprehensive. Next slide, please. Within the week after Toni Morrison died, August 5th, 2019, over 250 obituaries appeared in news media, electronic and print, in the German and French-speaking countries in Europe. My research covers the media reception of Morrison in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, and France. Of those more than 250 obituaries, some were by Black writers. Sharon Dodua-Otu, a native Londoner of Ghanaian parentage and a transplant to Germany, and she moved to Germany as a young adult, actually, but became such a good writer, maybe as a teenager she moved to Germany, but became such a good writer in German that she won in 2016 the prestigious Ingeborg Bachmann Prize in German Literature. An avid reader raised on a literary diet of Emily Bronte, Charles Dickens, Judy Blume, Roald Dahl, and so forth, Otu writes in her eulogy to Toni Morrison that in spite of immersing herself in the sagas of those writers' works, she never felt directly addressed, but rather tolerated at best. Quote, next slide, please. Oh dear, that one is out of place. Go to the next one and I'll come back to that one. I forgot to move that one. Go to the next one, please. Okay, this is the German, or what we just passed was the German version of this present quote. She says, "I knew that these novels portrayed a world in which I would not ever even figure. I would, if anything, always be on the margins. I don't remember who I was before, but afterwards I was a different person." This is before and after reading Beloved. Morrison, she says, Morrison wrote for people like me, those who grew up in a white society learning to deny their beauty, or those who constantly break down over the fact that they cannot protect their children from the racism that they themselves have experienced. Next slide. Eventually, I learned not to change who I am. And she recognized ultimately that the girl who had once dreamed of having blonde hair will one day have long gray afro hair. She refers to Toni Morrison's dreadlocks in her article, in her obituary as well. And as that girl who quietly and timidly used to let other pupils bully her, this girl now stands at the margin too, not caring about the center anymore. So this is a part of the obituary from Sharon Dodua-Otu. Next slide, please. No, please go back, if you don't mind, to the, I guess, number 3. It's the one I had. Yes, thank you. So Otu closes her obituary. Actually, it's a eulogy with a quote from Beloved, which for her captures the significance of Morrison for people of African descent. She says, in Beloved, she quotes, or in Beloved, she wrote, this is at the very end, this is conversation between Sethi and is it Paul D? I'm so bad with characters' names. The man whom she eventually ends up with. Is that Paul D or is Paul D or husband? Anyway, he says, me and you, we got more yesterday than anybody. We need some kind of tomorrow. End of quote from Beloved. With a passion and virtuosity that was distinguished by the Nobel Prize in 1993, Toni Morrison imagined for people of the African diaspora a kind of tomorrow. So all of my talk is actually about within the reception in those 5 countries, the German and French-speaking countries, within the reception in those countries of Toni Morrison, I am looking in this talk at her significance for Black people or other people of color. Okay, and so Sharon Otuadodu in this obituary expresses what, in her mind, Toni Morrison has done for people of the African diaspora, that she has given people of the African diaspora a kind of tomorrow, the kind that that is wished for at the end of Beloved. Okay, now if you would skip and go to, I guess it's about slide 5 now. Yes, thank you. The perspective of the African diaspora under the influence of Toni Morrison is also brought out in the obituary from the French woman activist and scholar Mabula Zumaoro, who, writing in the newspaper Le Monde, connected Morrison with the Guadeloupean novelist Maryse Condé, both as politically engaged novelists writing particularly narratives of women of the African diaspora. Next slide, please. Yes, so in her obituary, Zumaoro connects Morrison and Maryse Condé, both of them as politically engaged novelists writing primarily about women. Next slide, please. As with Sharon Dodua-Otu in Germany, whose life was changed by reading Beloved, so too with the French novelist Emily Boom. Boom's eulogy, entitled What Toni Morrison Gifted the World, foregrounds the socio-cultural political distance between herself and Morrison's female characters. Moreover, Boom deploys that distance concept to define Morrison's gift to the world. Next slide, please. Today, it's still hard for me to write the impression of foreignness I had reading Beloved. I found myself sucked into a universe astonishingly different from mine, a way of being Black, of inhabiting my skin, a way that had nothing in common with the young African woman born and living in Africa that I was, but which nevertheless was familiar. Toni Morrison spoke to an intimate version of myself beyond barriers. It was not about bringing up the color of my skin, a difficulty with being Black that did not register with me at all. I, who had grown up in a universe where I was the norm. End of quote. For the writer and reader, or for Boom, a writer and reader, it was not Sethi whom she identified with, but rather the ghost daughter Beloved, who demands justice. And Boom says, what was so grave, so cruel, that you, my mother, had to kill me in order to protect me? End of quote. Comprehending Morrison's intention, Boom acknowledges that there is neither any acceptable contrition nor any redemption. For Emily Boom, Toni Morrison's gift is expressing the truth behind appearances and affiliations, the somewhat crazy idea that each of us is a world unto her or himself, a story that deserves to be told. The subtle, necessary poetry inscribes us in a painful and exciting fraternity. So Emily Boom, when I was reading her obituary, I became a little bit surprised because I expected her to go into talking about how she felt an identity with some characters in the book. And she says, not because they were Black, because her own experience growing up in Cameroon, where she was not an other or marginalized, did not resonate with the situation of the characters in Beloved. However, it was one of the more universal aspects of the novel. The child, incredulous and demanding of the mother, why she would, what do you mean by killing me to save me? Next slide, please. Also from France, the acclaimed novelist Fatou Diom looked upon Toni Morrison as a spiritual elder sister. Diom composed an elegy with features of a praise song, opening with an invocation of reverence, invoking pillars of European philosophy, such as Montesquieu, Kant, Schiller, pillars of African diaspora philosophy, Jah Rastafari, Senghor, Baldwin, pillars of feminist philosophy, Yourcenar and Lessing. Diom's elegy moves in voice between griot and younger sister, sometimes extolling the music of the plume jazzante, the jazzing pen, that works like a maestro's baton, or the power of the pen that advocates for social justice, sometimes directly addressing the grande dame and reminiscing about an intimately personal gift from this elder sister. Diom had the opportunity to meet Toni Morrison, who gave her a small gift. And constantly moving back and forth between the literal and figurative African roots of humankind and the human branches around the world. Diom exalts the writer as planetary mother. Toni Morrison was a giant mahogany tree in her time. She knows no borders. So Fatou Diom is an acclaimed novelist, and her obituary, which is an elegy actually, in the magazine, the weekly magazine Jeune Afrique, is a literary work itself. Next slide, please. Okay, well, I just went through those points, the points of Fatou Diom's. I'll just run through those again. It had the features of a praise song, which is, of course, the African form of honoring someone. It is, and she begins it with the invocation of reverence, which would be very common in a praise song. It moves in voice between that of the African griot and of a younger sister that she sees herself in relationship with Toni Morrison, and sometimes extolling the music as a jazzing pen. But also this jazzing pen that works like a maestro's baton, or the power of the pen that advocates for social justice, sometimes directly, sometimes Diom directly addresses the grande dame, and reminisces about an intimately personal gift from this elder sister. She was a giant mahogany tree in her time. Okay, now to the next slide, please. France's Minister of Justice from 2012 to 2016 was Christiane Taubira, an outspoken, passionate activist in her home of French Guiana. Herself the author of 11 books, including some fiction, Christiane Taubira's writings could be viewed as an anthology of cultural Pan-Africanism. When the publishers of Toni Morrison's works did a republication of Song of Solomon last year, a preface was appended to it for the first time, written by Christiane Taubira. Before I get to that, however, next slide, please. Here is the obituary that Taubira wrote for Toni Morrison. She says, "I can still hear your sublime laugh when saying that no one describes love scenes like you do. And it's true. That's what you gave us above all, such a love for ourselves that you made us capable of loving the world." So this obituary from a former minister of the French government is also the work of a prolific writer herself. And so, as we'll see from the next piece that I will talk about, her own writing, when it is nonfiction, when it is an essay, is also infused with literary language as well. So for the next slide, please. As I said, she was asked to write a preface to the new edition of Song of Solomon that came out in 2020. The publisher, the French publisher, was doing some special editions of 5 of their most important writers, and Toni Morrison was one of those. And so they did this new special edition, and for the first time they had a preface written for it by Christiane Taubira. She is no longer in the government. She was Minister of Justice from 2012 to 2016. So her preface to this novel begins with, "Toni Morrison is a queen, an empress, a goddess, a woman, a voice, a pen, my light and yours." Next slide. And in the about, I think, 15-page preface, or maybe 12 pages or so, she does what could be considered a kind of overview of some of the main themes in Toni Morrison's novels, because she invokes most of the 11 novels in the preface to this one. But one point that I want to bring out that she discusses in the preface is about names. She says, among people of African descent, names count. They count for Muhammad Ali, for Kwame Ture, for Amiri Baraka, for Tupac Shakur. They count for Taj Mahal, for Sun Ra, for Fela Anikulapo, for Pharaoh, meaning Pharaoh Sanders, and so many others. So she's taking, for the most part, adopted names of people of the African diaspora who are in the arts or sports, who are show people who perform, and she's looking at their names as a reminder that For people of African descent, names count. And she continues, names count for the oppressed, for the dispossessed, for the disinherited, for those expelled from the human family. In literature, first names count even more. They are a territory. Here, meaning in Song of Solomon, it's about the book of first names. And what Morrison novel is a better example of first names counting than the novel that has as its protagonist Macon Dead the third, and his aunt Pilate, and his sisters First Corinthians, and the other one has a biblical name as well. In any case, so this is a part of the obituary that Christiane Taubira wrote for. Sorry, it's not part of the obituary. It's a part. She did write an obituary, and I quoted that. But this is a part of the preface that she wrote for the new edition of Song of Solomon. Okay, next slide, please. Another French writer, in this case, one who was influenced by Toni Morrison to the point of taking a phrase from one of the novels to the phrase and the theme of one of Toni Morrison's novels to write a book for children. Next slide, please. This is Comme un million de papillons noirs, which is the line from Morrison's last novel, God Help the Child, like a million black butterflies. Morrison is talking about talking about the woman's hair in describing it like a million black butterflies. And so, next slide, please. Lara Nsafo based this children's book on her own experience. She one day went home to her as a child and told her mother that kids were teasing her about her hair. And she didn't like that, and she wanted to change it. And so eventually she later decided to write a book for children, for Black children in France or in French-speaking Europe, in order to show them their own beauty and to, as her last point says, to rid themselves of the standards of beauty that they are shown and are and because they don't fit those standards of beauty, they are unhappy, and and so self-hatred is engendered very early in their lives. And so Lauren Safu and her artist colleague, Barbara Brun, put together the book, which shows the little Black girl with her beautiful butterfly hair. Okay, next slide, please. Now, beyond those writers, beyond those journalists and writers, I have examples of 6 other individuals. Well, some of them also are writers, but other individuals who have different stories about how reading Toni Morrison and encountering Toni Morrison influenced their lives. And these are all people of color in France or Germany. Boubacar Boris Diop is now a well-known Senegalese novelist. He probably lives as much of his time in France now as in Senegal. But Diop had written, I think, 3 or maybe 4 novels in French, and decided that he was going to begin writing instead in his mother tongue, Wolof. And so he's done, I think, 3 novels in Wolof, and he decided that he did not want to translate those because he felt that translating them is not only watering them down, because he felt that his translated novel in French is not saying the same thing that his novel in Wolof says. And so he had decided not to translate them. He met Toni Morrison when she was in Paris in 2006 as invited curator for a month-long series of cultural events, which ranged from dance to French hip-hop poetry, to discussions about the painting that she had selected to be the centerpiece of the project, which is the 19th century, the raft of the Medusa, and so her theme for this month-long series of activity was the foreigner's home. She, in her keynote lecture, linked her idea of the person's body being her or his only home, and linked that to this painting. And Boris Boubacar Diop was one of the French writers whom the organizers invited to participate in the program. And so he was able to meet Toni Morrison and spend quality time with her. And she was interested in his writing. I don't know if she had read any of his novels in English translation, but in any case, somehow she persuaded him that he should translate or allow for translation of his novels, acknowledging that no, it is not the same piece of work, but nevertheless, it has important things to share with the readership through translations. And so subsequent to that, Diop decided to have his novels translated into French anyway. And I know that at least one, probably 2 of those have been translated into English as well. Then there is an article in a newspaper about an Afro-feminist collective, which is named Mwasi. Mwasi is from the Lingala language in Congo, and this collective, in fact, one of the prime movers in this collective is Laurent Safou, the author of the children's book that I mentioned before. This Afro-feminist collective is influenced by women theorists, Black women theorists from the diaspora, including Kimberly Crenshaw, whose name is most closely associated with intersectionality, as well as they are influenced by pioneering Francophone Black women writers and thinkers, such as the Nadal sisters of Martinique from the time of the Harlem Renaissance, or from the 1930s in Paris, let's put it that way, and the Senegalese sociologist Awa Cham, but also other Black American feminists such as Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks. Lauren Safu herself read Tar Baby when she was 20. That was her introduction to Toni Morrison. She read Tar Baby, and as we know, Tar Baby, some of Tar Baby is located in Paris. And for Lauren Safu, this was the first heroine that she, well, I'm quoting from her. She said, "That was the first heroine that I could identify with, a book that spoke about me. It was at that moment that I began to write." So she was influenced by reading Tar Baby, and she has produced, let's say, another generation of Morrison spin-offs in writing the book for children. And then there is a Corsican popular music group called I Muvrini. Corsica is a département of France, but as we know, it used to be Italian, and so there are some portions, elements in the population in Corsica which have a conflicted relationship with French and being French. And so this is a popular music group. The leader of the group published a book in 2020, published a book in 2020, in which he speaks about the complex relations between Corsica and France. And in an interview in a newspaper, when someone asked him how he came to write that, he said, "Toni Morrison once said, if the book you want to read doesn't exist, you must write it." So here is a Corsican popular musician who knows Toni Morrison and is influenced by Toni Morrison to write his people's story as well. Then there is a Muslim psychologist living in Germany, a member of her name is Halima Mocevic. She's a member of the coordinating team of the Human Rights Platform in Germany. And she said that Toni Morrison helped her understand that the identity that mainstream German society gives her as a Muslim woman is not all that she is. She does not have to conduct her life according to Germans' expectations of a Muslim woman. And so she quotes from Toni Morrison, "The function of racism is to distract. It keeps you from doing your work." Now, Morrison said that in an interview in a newspaper in Germany at some point, and I think that's where Mocevic has this quotation from. So for her, and especially as a psychologist, she welcomed the opportunity or the perspective upon herself that looks away from racism. In other words, she is taking Toni Morrison's cue of getting rid of the gays so that she can go on and live her own life. Now, she is not a writer, but the gaze that so many people of color live their lives trying to either live up to or negate or something, she says, quoting Morrison, racism is a distraction. You have to get rid of it and get on with your life. Also, there is another woman of color who is a writer in Germany of Polish and Indian parentage. She says, she's interviewed in a newspaper because at the time her first novel came out earlier this year. She said, Toni Morrison said that she wrote for blacks. She did not explain herself to whites. The emotional path to the book has to be made. It's the same with me. The experiences of mixed race people are the norm in my novel. So again, she was able to remove the gaze also based on her understanding of Toni Morrison. Again, Morrison said this several times in interviews with German journalists that she did not write for the white reader. She wrote for Black readers. She welcomes white readership and hopes that they appreciate her work, but her work was directed to the Black reader. And so this writer, Polish, Indian, German, is doing the same. And finally, a podcast. There is a People of Color bookshelf podcast in Germany, headed by Georgina Fakumoju. And in an article in March of this year, she was quoted as saying the podcast discussed, or an article about the podcast rather, discussed racial socialization in translation, the context being the frenzy around the Dutch translator of Amanda Gorman's poem, which I'm sure everybody listening to this panel is aware of. And so at this People of Color bookshelf, or on this People of Color bookshelf podcast, they discussed the question of the relationship between ugliness and self-love in Toni Morrison, and also first of all, the racial socialization in translation. That was their theme. And then the relationship between ugliness and self-love in Toni Morrison's novels. They talked also about the internationalization of racism and the power of the white gaze. So these are just a few examples of the influence on people of African descent particularly, and other people of color in Germany and France, the influence that Toni Morrison's work has had on them. And some of these pieces that I've just quoted from were made or were published before she died. The one on Boubacar Boris Diop was from 2010, and the Afro-Feminist Organization article was from 2017. However, the other four, the Corsican Music Group, the psychologist, the Muslim psychologist, the German writer of Polish Indian parentage, and the People of Color bookshelf have all been since Morrison's death, some of them in 2020, and the People of Color Bookshelf podcasts being earlier this year. So it is very important for me in the work that I'm doing on the reception of Morrison in French and German-speaking Europe to look at the legacy that she has left, to look at the lasting impression that Toni Morrison has made on particularly on people of color in Europe, but on many other audiences as well. In fact, and I'll close with this one, there was earlier this year in February or so, a brief column in a German newspaper where they offered some let's say, coronavirus lockdown doldrums quotes from famous people in the world. And they had, I think, about 15. They had some philosophers, they had literary people, they had an economist. And so, again, the subject is, or what they did was the journalist looked through writings of these famous people and selected a statement to put in this list of, something to bring you out of the coronavirus lockdown doldrums. And Toni Morrison was among those 15. She was the only American among the 15. And the quote that they took from Toni Morrison, get this is to give you some relief from the lockdown doldrums. Morrison's statement, taken from Song of Solomon: if you want to fly, you got to give up the shit that weighs you down. So imagine German readers looking at this little piece for just some relief from the doldrums of lockdown, because it was February of this year. So, that was in the thick of it. And the fact that Morrison, the only American, quoted, and that particular quote I found to be very interesting. So I will close with that remark. That was not a part of the influence on Blacks, but nevertheless, one of my favorite things from German journalism on Morrison. So thank you for your attention.
There she is. Great.
Hi, thank you very much, Ain, for this great talk. I mean, it was really incredible to see. I mean, all those writers I don't know about. We can be intellectual and quote Marvel, had we but world enough and time, right? I mean, I would read them. And it's amazing to see how Toni Morrison spread her word all over the world. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. I don't know if Christa wants to add something before I go on to the questions. I mean, there are 2 questions already, so I don't know. Maybe you want to say something before I start.
Yeah, I mean, the most immediate thing I want to say, I think, is your, 2 things. One, the extremely pervasive and wide-reaching or effects that Toni Morrison has had, especially on writers and intellectuals and people of color outside of the United States and the diaspora. I mean, that's really fascinating. It's not surprising, but it's nice to hear these specifics from you, especially in those Western countries that for a very long time were not places of home, right, for people of color, and now they're becoming more and more such places. So I think it's wonderful to hear this and to contemplate what you've said. But I'm also really struck by that point you made towards the end of your presentation, that Morrison herself said that her books are meant for Black readers, right? And that she hopes that white readers will appreciate her work, but she's not writing for white people out there. And I had to juxtapose that statement you made with my own presentation, where I actually speak about precisely that to a white reader, the novel has a tremendous power to allow us to connect with someone who is other, but to connect with them in a non-racist way. So I think, and I don't think those 2 points stand in contradiction with each other. I mean, it's a testament to Morrison's writing that she could be both.
Yeah.
She could both be, this life force for people of color, but also teach white people like me so much about what it means to, I mean, in a little bit of a, a romantic way to explain to us what it means to be human. And I think she does that in her novels and I think she succeeds. Like she says, she wants to write from a racialized perspective, but in a non-racist way. I think it's just in that way, she is, in my mind, one of the most terrific writers we've had in the English language.
Wow. Thank you, Christa. Amy, would you like to respond to that, or shall I go to the audience?
Well, no, I'll thank Christa for the comment, but why don't you go to the audience? Yeah.
So I have here a question. Oops. Now I have to work this out. The little thing that has to go up there. So the first question goes for Christa. Could you explore a little bit more the connection between the music genre, jazz, and the narrator of the novel? How can we think of it in formal terms? And for both Anne and Christa, I'd like to ask both professors if they think there is a writer working today who is a kind of heir to Toni Morrison. Thank you. And that is a question from one of our PhDs, Alison Oliveira. Then, do you want me to read all the questions or just, I don't know. Let's read them all so that you can put them all together.
Yeah.
What do you think about the relevance of literary awards such as Nobel and Booker Prize nowadays? What is the impact of these awards on the reception of works by Black women authors? And then for Professor Adams, what do you consider to be the biggest challenges in translating Toni Morrison's works into languages such as French and German? I laugh because, I can imagine the challenges of translating Morrison into any language. So that's it. So thank you very much for the questions. And now on to you, girls.
Christa, why don't you go ahead? Because the first question is
I'll just respond very quickly. I think it's kind of obvious that the narrative voice in the novel jazz pretty much parallels a musical jazz piece. So obviously the narrator can be said to be the conductor or the person who leads the jazz band, and you can do a fabulous analysis of the novel as a literary jazz piece, if you will. And I think that especially if some of you have taught jazz before or will be teaching the novel jazz with students, I think that would be a very productive and I think really, really fun way to engage students with a novel, to just say, hey, we're dealing here with a narrative, but also with narrative traditions. And in the African American storytelling tradition, we also have jazz that carries a lot of the cultural force and cultural revolutionary kind of interventions in dominant culture. So I think one way to approach jazz is obviously by looking at it as a piece of jazz in its very formal elements. I mean, there's blues in this novel, there's syncopation, there's creative freedom. That was kind of the connection to my point probably the most, like creative freedom in terms of there is no form as such that needs to be adhered to necessarily. I mean, when you get into a jazz performance, it becomes in the moment, it becomes itself, right? I mean, it's not something it's not like Western classical music where you follow it more so note by note, though even there's obviously creative freedom too by musicians, but I think that notion is much more dramatic and much more of a given in a jazz piece. And I think a connection to my argument would be also that jazz absolutely, the success of a jazz moment depends on on the audience participating. And I think that's what Morrison asked us with, at least with jazz, so directly with this postmodern narrator in jazz at the end to say, hey, I hope you weren't sleeping while reading this. And now that you're done with my story, please take it from me and make your own stories out of it. Think of people in your life and what they've done or what you're doing. So I think that's another direct kind of parallel with jazz music is, and again, think about it, like as Professor Adams was saying, the incredible not success, but what Morrison achieves here. I mean, she doesn't just provide a couple of parallels and, you know, some creative connections to jazz music. No, I mean, I think this novel is a performance by the narrative voice, very much in line with any kind of artistic performance, and in the African-American tradition, particularly the performance of jazz. So that's...
I would certainly agree with that. I would, and particularly with the role of the narrator, I would not use the word conductor of a jazz.
Right. Yeah.
Because there isn't one.
Right. Yes.
There's somebody that kind of holds it together, because as we know, that artist, you know, does, it's usually his thing, sometimes her, and just kind of turns his body to the, you know, to the next person who is to solo. So I consider, and here the narrator for me is the person who holds it together.
Or tries to and can't quite contain all the energy.
Yeah, that's
wonderful.
I would say to the other two questions, the one on the effects of prizes such as the Nobel and the Booker on, I think the question asked about Black women's writing specifically. Well, Toni Morrison said, I don't know whether it was a part of her, it wasn't a part of her speech, that gorgeous, wonderful speech, but in relation to the, maybe to journalists or so after, you know, the ceremony and so forth, she said, well, she certainly said it, to journalists. She said, my winning this prize is not about me. It says that the playing field has been made a little more, they've ironed out some of the you know, the rough points in the playing field. So she says what this means is that the world is now recognizing kinds of literature and voices that that they had not recognized before, not the world, but people who have power in literary fields recognize now. So she saw her importance there, or her significance, as opening the gate, so to speak. That's what I think about it, which now suggests that that there could be more. I know that in Germany, as I said, when I was talking about Sharon Dodua Otu, she won the Ingeborg Bachmann, and that is big time. The Ingeborg Bachmann Prize is big time in Germany. And so, and that was her first, she won it for a short story. I'm not sure whether the prize awards only short fiction or not, but she won it for a short story. I do know that. And so, so I think that what Toni Morrison's, I think that the prizes now are are a bit open. Regarding the Booker Prize, just recently, the Zimbabwean writer Tsitsi Dangarembga was shortlisted for the Booker, did not win it. However, she did win very recently a German, the German. It has a very ordinary name, like the German Prize for Literature, der Deutsche Literaturpreis, or something like that. Okay, and so it obviously the work does not have to be written in German, and so this year the prize was awarded to this Zimbabwean writer. So. Those are some facts which could be brought in answer to the question. There could be many interpretations. And as far as translation challenges, well, I'm smiling because when I leave this session, I am going to receive or meet the editor, Toni Morrison's French editor. Her name is Dominique Bourgois. She is the widow of the publishing company that bears her late husband's name. And she is a visiting critic at my university as of today. And so there are, and she hired the translators for most of the Toni Morrison work. And they, for example, they retranslated the first three novels that had been published in French. Bluest Eye, Sula was not in the early translations, but Bluest Eye, Song of Solomon, and Tar Baby. When they took over Toni Morrison's, when they took her over as one of their writers, they felt that the first translations were not worthy, and so they redid them, including a revision of the French title for Song of Solomon. There's the French word chant, and there's the word la chanson, and the first version had la chanson de Salomon, but the second translation has chant, and Madame Bourgois can tell you why chant was. It has to be chant and not chanson. And I said, well, what is it in the Bible? And she said,
that was my question.
In the Bible, it's chanson, but that doesn't mean that it is the better choice for this novel. So, but yeah, I did ask her the question because I thought, that would be a simple thing, whatever the Bible says. But she says, no. Obviously, the first people who translated it used the Bible term, perhaps thinking, it'll be entirely familiar to the French reading public. Anyway, but there are many challenges, and the translators are very attentive to trying to, they appreciate Toni Morrison's language, and they are very attentive to the challenge and to the privilege of trying to represent her in English. And one more thing from a personal encounter that I can say in that regard is I've been looking at the German and French, especially the German translations of Toni Morrison for about 40 years now, and I was contracted on a consultant basis with by the German translator to vet the translation in terms of African American cultural items, because I had found in some of their early translations that there were some cultural things that the translator, even though very capable in American English, the translator was not aware of the sub-language that African American English is sometimes. And so they missed some of those things. And so I would sit with this translator, and I would say, he would do the translation. The publisher would send me his manuscript, and then we would sit together. And I tried to urge him, sometimes not on specific cultural items, but on the poetry of her language. And the translator would often say, you can't do that in German. And I would say, you can't do it in English either. But she does it, right? Because we all know there are things in her text that that are not, so that was that certainly is one of the challenges, trying to render
impossibilities.
Yeah, right. Her inventions, trying to render her inventions. And I talked about that with one of the with the person who translated the last 3 of her books, including the book of essays. And she said, I appreciate that. And for me, the challenge is trying to somehow convey the inventiveness, but having it come out so that French readers will accept it. So those are some of the challenges that I, have personal knowledge of anyway.
Excuse me, we still haven't tackled the question of who's writing, along the lines of Toni Morrison today. And since we have, only 2 minutes left, I'd like to say, to link this question, who's writing, who's walking on Toni Morrison's steps, and a woman who actually got a prize, and that is Bernardine Evaristo. I was reminded of Toni Morrison by her writing, because, it is such a unique, not that she imitates Toni Morrison or anything of that, but, it's this inventiveness of language that she borrows from Toni Morrison. And she also got the Booker in 2019, right? So
yes.
Here we go. But what about you two? Would you remember anybody else? Because, while you were talking, I was trying to think, who do I know? I thought of her, but can you think of anybody else who's following Toni Morrison's steps? And no, I also teach this Colson Whitehead, but I don't think he writes in the style of Toni Morrison, right? I don't know. So we don't have the answer, Alison. Sorry, that's the student who asked. We don't know.
I'm not even going to go there. I'll tell you right now.
So I think Beatriz, where is Beatriz? Can we wrap it up now, Beatriz?
Yeah, sure.
So I'd like to thank very much Christa and Aine for such an enjoyable afternoon, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, all 3 of you, for being with us, and for, it was so enjoyable to hear where Toni Morrison's reach goes and how far it goes. And also, Jazz, I haven't read much of Morrison, but Jazz was one of those that I was quite lost in. And by following the narrator and formal aspects of the novel, I think it's going to be very helpful for me personally to reread it. And in my and Mariana's behalf, we'd just like to thank all 3 of you for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. Thank you, Professor Adams. It was wonderful to meet you today and everybody else.
Thank you.
Wonderful conference. Thank you.
Yeah, it was good.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for this amazing
Bye,
afternoon.
everyone.
Bye-bye.